My neighbor tried to steal my land, but my lawyer made him regret it in court. Thomas Mitchell stood at the edge of his property, jaw clenched, as he watched Frank Donovan confidently hammer the last stake into the ground, completing the line of bright orange surveyor's flags that cut a full 12 feet into what Thomas knew was his land. The unseasonably hot April sun beat down on his neck as he felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same sensation he'd experienced 3 days ago when he first spotted Frank clearing trees in that contested corner of the property. "What exactly do you think you're doing, Frank?" Thomas called out, trying to keep his voice steady despite the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. Frank straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow with a handkerchief that disappeared back into the pocket of his well-worn jeans. He turned to face Thomas with a self-satisfied smile that had irritated neighbors up and down Oak Ridge Lane for the 15 years he lived there. "Just marking what's rightfully mine, Tom. According to my survey, everything on this side of the flags belongs to me." Frank gestured broadly at the strip of land in question, a narrow but significant portion that included 3 mature oak trees and the small garden shed Thomas had built 5 years prior. "That's ridiculous. That shed's been there for years, and you've never said a word about it." Thomas stepped forward, crossing onto the disputed territory. "I've got the property lines in my deed. This is my land, Frank." Frank's smile didn't waver. "Well, I've got a brand new survey that says otherwise. Official documentation from Westland Surveying. You might want to double-check your paperwork, neighbor." Thomas felt his face flush with heat that had nothing to do with the sun. The Mitchells had purchased their 3-acre countryside property in Millfield 7 years ago, drawn by the peaceful rural setting just 30 minutes outside the city where Thomas worked as an electrical engineer. It had been their dream home, a place where his wife Sarah could garden and their children could explore the woods. The property had been their sanctuary, especially during the pandemic when they converted part of the backyard into an outdoor living space. Frank Donovan had been a thorn in their side from the beginning. Complaints about their children's treehouse being visible from his property, anonymous calls to the township about their fence height, disputes about drainage issues that had cost Thomas thousands in landscaping adjustments. But this was different. This was theft, plain and simple. "I know exactly where my property line is," Thomas said, his voice now taut with barely controlled frustration. "That survey of yours is wrong." Frank shrugged, the picture of casual indifference. "Take it up with the county if you want. I'm starting construction on my new workshop next week." He nodded toward the cleared area. "Going to need to take down those oaks, of course. They're on my side now." The 3 oak trees had been one of the main selling points when they purchased the house. Their daughter Emma had a swing hanging from one of them. Their son Jack had built a fort beneath another. The thought of Frank cutting them down made Thomas's blood run cold. "You touch those trees and we're going to have serious problems," Thomas warned, taking another step forward. Frank's smile finally faded, replaced by something harder. "Is that a threat, Mitchell? Because I've got the paperwork and I've already filed it with the county. This isn't up for debate." The standoff was interrupted by Sarah calling from the back porch, her voice carrying across the yard. "Thomas, everything okay out there?" Thomas took a deep breath, forcing himself to step back. "We'll see about that paperwork, Frank. Don't do anything with that land until we sort this out." As he walked back toward his house, Thomas could feel Frank's eyes on his back. Inside, Sarah was waiting, concern evident on her face. "He's claiming 12 feet of our property," Thomas explained, voice shaking slightly as he pulled out his phone. "Says he has a new survey. He's planning to cut down the oak trees next week." Sarah's eyes widened. "He can't do that. Those are our trees." "I know," Thomas nodded, his decision made. "I think it's time we talk to a lawyer." "I'm not going to sugarcoat this, Mr. Mitchell. Boundary disputes can be complicated and expensive." Elaine Vasquez, a compact woman with salt and pepper hair pulled into a severe bun, leaned forward in her chair. Her office at Vasquez and Associates was modest but impeccably organized, with law books lining the walls and framed certifications speaking to her 27 years of experience in property law. Thomas and Sarah sat across from her, the folder containing their property deed, original survey, and photographs of Frank's orange flags spread open on the polished desk between them. "But from what you've shown me," Elaine continued, tapping the original survey document, "something doesn't add up with your neighbor's claim." Relief washed over Thomas. He barely slept in the 3 days since his confrontation with Frank, and the sound of chainsaws starting up in the distance that morning had sent him into a panic before he realized they were coming from another direction. "So what do we do?" Sarah asked, her hand finding Thomas's and squeezing. Elaine pulled a legal pad toward her and began writing in precise, angular script. "First, we're going to file for an emergency injunction to prevent any alteration to the disputed land until this is resolved. That means no tree removal, no construction, nothing." Thomas nodded. "And then?" Then we're going to commission our own independent survey. Elaine looked up from her notes. I work with several reputable surveyors who are court-approved experts. It'll cost you about $1,500, but if your original survey is correct, and I suspect it is, we'll need that expert testimony. The amount made Thomas wince internally, but he thought about those oak trees, about Emma's swing and Jack's fort, and nodded firmly. Whatever it takes. Good. Elaine made another note. We'll also request copies of all of Mr. Donovan's documentation. I want to see the survey he's filed and when exactly it was conducted. Do you think he falsified it? Sarah asked quietly. Elaine's expression remained neutral. I never jump to conclusions, but in my experience, sudden boundary changes after years of established use often involve creative interpretations of property lines. Let's just say I've seen this movie before. As they left the lawyer's office 45 minutes later with a plan in place, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced since finding those orange flags: hope. That hope was short-lived. The following morning, Thomas's phone rang while he was in a virtual meeting. Seeing it was Sarah, he excused himself and answered. He's here with a chainsaw. Sarah's voice was tight with panic. He's going to cut down the trees right now. Thomas's heart raced. The injunction isn't filed yet. Elaine's office said they're submitting it today. What? I'm on my way. Thomas ended the call, hastily explained a family emergency to his colleagues, and was in his car within minutes. The 20-minute drive felt like hours. When he finally turned onto Oak Ridge Lane, he could hear the whine of a chainsaw before he even reached the house. He pulled into the driveway with a spray of gravel and ran toward the sound. In the disputed corner of the property, Frank stood with a chainsaw in hand, a notch already cut into the base of the oldest oak tree. Two other men Thomas didn't recognize were standing nearby with ropes and harnesses, clearly preparing to ensure the tree fell in a controlled direction toward Thomas's yard. Stop, Thomas shouted, running across the lawn. You can't do this, Frank. We have a boundary dispute in process. Frank turned off the chainsaw, the sudden silence almost as jarring as the noise had been. Your dispute, not mine. I know where my property line is. He gestured to the orange flags still marking the supposed boundary. Sarah stood on their back porch, phone to her ear, clearly in the middle of a call. Thomas guessed she was talking to Elaine. Our lawyer is filing an emergency injunction today, Thomas said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. If you cut down these trees before that's resolved, you're going to be liable for damages. Frank laughed. You threatening me again, Mitchell? These men are witnesses. He nodded toward his companions. These trees are on my property according to the county records, and I have every right to remove them. Thomas stepped closer, positioning himself between Frank and the notched tree. Show me these county records. Right now. I don't have to show you anything, Frank sneered. Now get off my property before I call the sheriff for trespassing. Actually, came a new voice from the direction of the driveway. I'd like to see those records, too. All heads turned to see Elaine Vasquez striding across the lawn, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm and an expression that could freeze fire. Behind her walked a uniformed sheriff's deputy. You've got to be kidding me, Thomas said, staring at the stack of documents Elaine had spread across her conference room table. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation with Frank and his chainsaw. The independent survey had been completed, confirming what Thomas already knew. The property line was exactly where his original deed indicated, and Frank's claim was entirely baseless. But that wasn't what had prompted Thomas' incredulous response. I wish I were, Elaine replied, tapping a yellowed document with a manicured fingernail. According to the records we've obtained, this isn't the first time Frank Donovan has been involved in a property dispute. Not by a long shot. Sarah leaned forward, scanning the documents. He's done this before. 3 times that we've been able to discover. Once here in Millfield with the previous owners of the Henderson's place on the other side of his property. Once in Rockland County before he moved here. And once in Vermont where he owned property in the early 2000s. Thomas felt a slow burn of anger rising in his chest. And what happened in those cases? Elaine sorted through the papers, pulling out a small stack held together with a paperclip. In the first case, in Vermont, the neighbors settled. Donovan claimed his survey error gave him an additional 20 feet of lakefront, significantly increasing his property value. The neighbors were elderly and, according to their son, whom I spoke with yesterday, didn't have the resources or energy for a prolonged legal battle. So he got away with it, Thomas said flatly. Yes. In Rockland County, he tried the same approach, claiming a newly discovered survey showed his property extended into what his neighbors had been using as a side yard for decades. That neighbor happened to be a retired judge who didn't back down. Donovan eventually dropped his claim when confronted with the original surveys, claiming it had all been a misunderstanding. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. And the Hendersons? We never heard anything about a dispute with them. That's because it was settled quietly as part of the sales process when they moved 4 years ago, Elaine explained. Donovan claimed their driveway encroached on his property by 3 feet. Rather than delay their home sale, they agreed to pay him $8,000 to release the claim. The title company just wanted the problem to go away. Thomas stood up and walked to the window, trying to process what he was hearing. So this is his game. He fabricates property disputes and either bullies or wears people down until they give in. It appears so, Elaine confirmed. And here's where it gets interesting. The new survey he filed for your property, it wasn't conducted by Westland Surveying, as he claimed. Thomas turned back. What? Elaine held up a letter on Westland's surveying letterhead. They have no record of ever surveying your properties. When I show them the document filed with the county, they confirm it's a forgery using their outdated letterhead. Sarah gasped. That's criminal, isn't it? Filing falsified documents with the county recorder? Yes, that crosses the line from civil dispute to potential criminal fraud, Elaine said, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. I've already spoken with the district attorney's office. They're very interested in the pattern we've uncovered. Thomas returned to the table, his mind racing. So what's our next move? Elaine gathered the documents into a neat pile. We have a hearing scheduled for next Monday on our motion for declaratory judgment. That would formally establish your property line according to the original and new surveys, both of which agree. But given this new information, I suggest we go on the offensive. What do you mean? Sarah asked. Frank Donovan is counting on you being too intimidated or financially constrained to fight back effectively. People like him rely on their victims giving up. I propose we file a countersuit for harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and slander of title. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Slander of title? It's a legal term for when someone falsely claims an interest in your property that clouds your ownership. It's exactly what he's done, and it can entitle you to damages, especially if we can prove he did it knowingly and maliciously. Which we can, Thomas said, nodding toward the stack of documents showing Frank's history. Exactly. Elaine smiled, a predatory gleam in her eye. And when the DA's office concludes their investigation into the forged survey documents, he may be facing criminal charges as well. Sarah looked uncertain. Won't that just escalate things? Make him even more difficult to deal with? Thomas took her hand. He tried to steal our land and cut down our trees, Sarah. He's not going to stop unless someone makes him stop. The Millfield County Courthouse was a stately red brick building that had presided over the town square for over a century. Thomas had driven past it countless times but had never had reason to step inside until today. Now seated in courtroom 3 beside Sarah and Elaine, he watched as Judge Eleanor Winters reviewed the stack of documents before her, occasionally glancing over her reading glasses at the two parties. On the other side of the aisle, Frank Donovan sat beside his attorney, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit who had introduced himself as Maxwell Reed from a prestigious firm in the city. Thomas had done some research. Reed specialized in real estate litigation and charged upwards of $500 an hour. The presence of such high-priced legal talent suggested Frank was taking their challenge seriously. Before we proceed with arguments on the motion for declaratory judgment, Judge Winters said, setting down a document and removing her glasses, I'd like to address some concerning information that's been presented to this court. She picked up another folder, the one containing the evidence of Frank's previous property disputes and a forensic analysis of the forged survey. Mr. Reed, has your client had an opportunity to review these allegations? Reed stood, buttoning his jacket smoothly. Yes, Your Honor. And we categorically deny any wrongdoing. These are baseless accusations meant to distract from the legitimate boundary dispute before the court. Elaine rose next. Your Honor, if I may, the evidence we submitted shows a clear pattern of similar disputes initiated by Mr. Donovan across 3 states. More significantly, the survey he filed with the county has been confirmed as fraudulent by the very company whose letterhead was misappropriated. That's a serious allegation, Counselor, the judge noted. One supported by expert testimony from Westland Surveying and forensic document analysis, Elaine responded. We've also provided the court with evidence of Mr. Donovan's previous settlements obtained through similar means. Thomas glanced at Frank, who maintained a neutral expression, though Thomas thought he detected a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there before. Judge Winters turned her attention to Frank's attorney. Mr. Reed, how do you explain the discrepancy between your client's survey and the original property survey, which has been confirmed by a new independent survey? Reed cleared his throat. Your Honor, we believe there was an error in the original survey that has unfortunately been perpetuated. My client discovered this discrepancy when reviewing his own property documents and sought to correct it. By filing a survey that Westland Surveying states they never conducted, the judge asked pointedly. My client used a freelance surveyor who apparently used Westland's letterhead improperly. Mr. Donovan had no knowledge of this impropriety. Thomas felt his blood pressure rising at the blatant lie. Frank had specifically claimed the survey came from Westland. Elaine was quick to pounce. Your Honor, that directly contradicts Mr. Donovan's statements to my clients, wherein he specifically cited Westland Surveying as the source of his survey. We have a sworn affidavit to that effect. The judge nodded slowly. I see. She turned back to Frank's attorney. Mr. Reed, I'm troubled by these inconsistencies. I'm even more troubled by the pattern of similar disputes initiated by your client in other jurisdictions. Reed spread his hands. Your Honor, previous property disputes are irrelevant to the boundary issues in this case, which should be decided on their own merits. I disagree, Counselor. Judge Winters replied firmly. Pattern and practice can be highly relevant, especially when allegations of fraud are involved. She shuffled through more papers before continuing. I'm also aware that the District Attorney's Office has opened an investigation into possible criminal charges related to the filing of falsified documents. At this, Thomas saw Frank shift uncomfortably in his seat and whisper something to his attorney. Reed's expression darkened momentarily before he regained his professional composure. In light of the evidence presented, the judge continued, I'm granting the Mitchells' motion for declaratory judgment. The property line shall be established according to the original deed and survey, which has been confirmed by an independent third-party survey. She tapped her gavel lightly. The temporary restraining order preventing any alterations to the disputed property will remain in effect until proper boundary markers can be installed by a court-appointed surveyor. Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him. Sarah squeezed his hand tightly. 6 months had passed since the courthouse victory. Autumn had transformed the oak trees at the edge of Thomas' property into a blaze of russet and gold, their leaves spiraling down to carpet the ground where Jack and Emma were busy collecting the best specimens for a school project. Thomas sat on the back porch with a mug of coffee, watching his children play beneath the trees that had almost been lost. Sarah stepped out to join him, handing him an envelope. This just came. Thomas recognized the letterhead of the district attorney's office. He opened it, quickly scanning the contents before looking up at his wife with a mix of satisfaction and disbelief. Frank pleaded guilty to 2 counts of filing falsified documents. He summarized, 18 months probation, community service, and full restitution to all affected parties, including the Hendersons and his previous victims in Rockland County and Vermont. Sarah sat beside him, wrapping her cardigan tighter against the autumn chill. So it's really over. Completely over, Thomas confirmed, setting the letter down. The DA says our case opened the floodgates. Once they started investigating, they found 7 other instances where Frank had pulled similar schemes. Some of the victims didn't even realize what had happened until the DA contacted them. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their children beneath the oak trees that were now unquestionably legally theirs. Have you seen him lately? Sarah asked. Thomas shook his head. Frank had become a ghost in the neighborhood, rarely emerging from his house except to leave for work. The word about his schemes had spread quickly throughout Oak Ridge Lane and beyond. Thomas had heard through the grapevine that Frank was considering selling his house, unable to face the neighbors he had attempted to defraud. Mrs. Watkins told me there was a realtor at his place yesterday, Sarah said, as if reading his thoughts. Looks like he's finally moving. Thomas wasn't surprised. Community had always been important in Millfield. It was one of the reasons they'd chosen to live here. Frank's systematic attempts to take advantage of his neighbors had left him isolated, a pariah on a street where block parties and neighborhood watch meetings were the norm. The sound of car tires on gravel drew their attention. A familiar sedan was pulling into their driveway. Is that Elaine? Sarah asked, surprised. Thomas stood as their lawyer emerged from the car carrying a small folder. They hadn't seen her since settling the final paperwork 3 months earlier. Sorry to drop by unannounced, Elaine called as she approached the porch. I was in the area for another case and wanted to deliver this in person. She handed Thomas the folder. Inside was a check, significantly larger than the settlement amount they'd agreed to in court. Thomas looked at Elaine questioningly. The full restitution ordered by the criminal court, she explained with a small smile of satisfaction, plus interest and additional damages awarded to all of Frank's victims. The judge was particularly impressed by how your case broke open the pattern of fraud. Sarah studied the check with wide eyes. This is considerably more than we expected. Elaine nodded. The court took into account not just the legal fees and stress, but the potential damage that would have occurred if he'd succeeded in cutting down your trees. An arborist testified about their value, both monetary and environmental. Thomas invited Elaine to sit, and Sarah went inside to bring another cup of coffee. From the yard, the children's laughter carried on the crisp autumn air. I heard he's selling his house, Thomas commented, nodding toward Frank's property. Not by choice, Elaine replied. Part of the restitution agreement. He has to liquidate assets to pay back everyone he defrauded. The court also barred him from purchasing property in 3 counties for the duration of his probation. Thomas shook his head in amazement. When we first found those orange flags, I never imagined it would end like this. Most people would have given in, Elaine observed. Paid him off to avoid the hassle, like the Hendersons did. That's what he was counting on. We came close, Thomas admitted. If you hadn't shown up when you did with that restraining order. You did the hard part, Elaine insisted. You decided to stand your ground. Too many people don't.